Imagine waking up tomorrow and your tap runs dry. Not for an hour, not for a day, permanently, no warning, no backup plan, just nothing. Now, most of us in the modern world would panic. We'd scramble to buy bottled water. We'd call someone. We'd expect the government to fix it within days. But here's what most people don't realize. For the vast majority of human history, that scenario wasn't a nightmare. It was just Tuesday. Water scarcity, water wars, water politics, these aren't new problems that showed up with climate change or overpopulation. They are ancient problems. They shaped which civilizations rose to power and which ones collapsed into dust. They determined who got to eat, who got to rule, and who got to survive. And the really unsettling part? The same patterns playing out right now. Governments cutting off water to enemies, corporations buying up aquifers, entire cities built in places that simply cannot sustain them. All of it has happened before. We just forgot. So let's go back, way back, and trace the dark, fascinating history of water, how humans have fought over it, engineered it, weaponized it, and built entire empires on the promise of controlling it. When you picture ancient Mesopotamia, the land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers in what is now Iraq, you might imagine a lush, fertile landscape. And in places, it was. But the reality was far messier. Those rivers flooded unpredictably. Sometimes they swelled so violently they wiped out entire villages. Other times, the rains simply didn't come, and the land cracked open like old pottery. To survive in that environment, early humans didn't just need to find water, they needed to control it. Around 6,000 years ago, the Sumerians started building something that would change human history forever. Irrigation canals. Not small ditches, massive engineered waterways that redirected river water across miles of otherwise dry land. They built weirs to regulate flow. They dug reservoirs. They assigned people specifically to manage and maintain the system. And here's where it gets interesting. Once you have a shared water system that an entire community depends on, you need rules. You need someone in charge. You need hierarchy. Scholars like Carl Wittfogel, who wrote a provocative book called Oriental Despotism in 1957, argued that it was precisely this need to manage water that gave rise to the world's first authoritarian states. He called them hydraulic civilizations. The idea, whoever controls the water controls everything else. The priest who decided when to open the canal gates? He wasn't just a religious figure, he was the most powerful person in the region. This wasn't unique to Mesopotamia. The same pattern played out in ancient Egypt, where the entire agricultural calendar revolved around the Nile's annual flood. In China, where massive hydraulic works along the Yellow River required centralized coordination on a scale that may have given rise to imperial bureaucracy. In the Indus Valley, where the cities of Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro had sophisticated drainage systems that archaeologists still find impressive today. Water didn't just support these early civilizations. Water was the civilization. The engineering, the politics, the religion, the economy, all of it was organized around one fundamental question. Who gets the water and when? And the darker flip side of that question was always lurking underneath. What happens when it runs out? Here's a pattern that repeats itself throughout history with almost eerie consistency. A civilization rises, reaches incredible heights, and then, seemingly out of nowhere, collapses. And when researchers dig into the causes, water is almost always somewhere in the story. Take the late Bronze Age collapse around 1200 BCE. This is one of history's great mysteries. In the space of just a few decades, nearly every major civilization in the Eastern Mediterranean either collapsed or was severely weakened. The Hittites, Mycenaean Greece, the Egyptian New Kingdom, the city of Ugarit, gone or crippled almost simultaneously. For centuries, historians blamed invasions, the famous Sea Peoples who appear in Egyptian records. But more recent research, including paleoclimatology studies published in the last decade, points strongly toward a prolonged multi-decade drought that destabilized food systems, triggered mass migrations, and set off a chain reaction of societal collapse. When the harvests fail and the wells go dry, people move. When people move, they conflict with other people. When enough people conflict at once, entire systems break down. The same story echoes in the collapse of the classic Maya civilization around 800–900 CE. The Maya built extraordinary cities. They were brilliant astronomers and mathematicians. And they developed sophisticated water management systems, reservoirs, canals, terraced agriculture, specifically because they lived in a region with highly seasonal rainfall and almost no rivers. But by the 9th century, a series of severe droughts hit the Yucatan Peninsula hard. The reservoirs ran low, harvests collapsed, political systems that had been stable for centuries started fracturing. Cities were abandoned, the population crashed. And while it wasn't only drought, political instability and warfare played roles too, the water crisis was the trigger that set everything else in motion. This is what makes the history of water so sobering. It's not just ancient. The Dust Bowl of the 1930s in the American Great Plains, that catastrophe that drove hundreds of thousands of families from their homes, that defined a generation of American poverty, was a combination of drought and catastrophically bad land management. People had plowed up native grasslands that had held moisture in the soil for millennia. When the rain stopped coming and the topsoil literally blew away in enormous black clouds, there was nothing left to hold anything together. Civilizations are more fragile than we think, and water is usually holding the seams together. If you're finding this fascinating, you're in the right place. The Origin Archive is where we dig into the hidden mechanics of history, the real forces underneath the stories we were taught in school. Hit subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. Now let's talk about one of the most impressive water engineering achievements in human history and also one of the most political, the Roman aqueducts. At their peak, Rome had 11 major aqueducts supplying the city. Together, they delivered somewhere around 1 million cubic meters of water per day. That's enough to fill roughly 400 Olympic swimming pools every single day for a city of about 1 million people. The aqueducts fed public baths, private homes of the wealthy, fountains in public squares, and the sewage system. The Aqua Appia, built in 312 BCE, was the first. By the time of the Aqua Traiana in 109 CE, Roman engineers were pulling water from sources 60 kilometers away using only gravity, no pumps, just precise, almost obsessive calculation of gradient and elevation. It was genuinely extraordinary engineering. But here's the part that usually gets left out of the admiring history lessons. Water access in Rome was deeply unequal, and it was designed to be. The wealthiest citizens, senators, equestrians, the imperial household received direct pipe connections to their private homes. They paid fees, yes, but they had water flowing through lead pipes directly into their kitchens and courtyards. Everyone else got the public fountains, which were fine. Rome had thousands of them, but the difference in access between the richest and poorest Romans was enormous. And control of the water system was a tool of political power. Emperors built aqueducts to win public favor. Generals used water supply as a weapon of siege warfare. Cutting off a city's water was often more effective than battering down its walls. During the Gothic Wars of the 6th century CE, Gothic forces severed the aqueducts supplying Rome. The city's population, which had already been declining, collapsed dramatically. Without water, without functioning baths and sanitation, the greatest city in the Western world became essentially uninhabitable. The fall of Rome wasn't just about barbarian invasions and political corruption. It was also about infrastructure. When the systems that moved water stopped working, everything else stopped working with them. Let's slow down for a moment, because this next part of the history is darker than most people realize. Water has been used as a weapon of war for as long as there have been wars. The Assyrians, one of the most feared military powers of the ancient world, were particularly ruthless about it. When they conquered a city or a region that resisted them, they sometimes destroyed the irrigation infrastructure deliberately, not to use it themselves, to make sure the people who lived there could never recover. Salting fields and breaking canals was a form of permanent punishment. In 612 BCE, when the Babylonians and Medes sacked Nineveh, the great Assyrian capital, they reportedly diverted a river to help breach the city walls. Water as a battering ram. Skip forward to the Second World War. In May 1943, British bombers carried out Operation Chastise, the famous Dam Busters raid, specifically targeting the Möhne and Edersee dams in Germany's Ruhr Valley. The goal was to destroy the water and power supply to Germany's industrial heartland. The raids caused catastrophic flooding that killed around 1,600 people, many of them forced labourers and prisoners of war. And then there's a tactic that goes back at least to medieval siege warfare and continues in various forms today. Simply cutting off the water supply to civilian populations to force surrender or cause suffering. It's been documented in conflicts from Syria to Yemen in recent decades. The United Nations considers deliberate destruction of water infrastructure a potential war crime. And yet it keeps happening. Because it works. Water is power. And in war, power is everything. We're just past the halfway point, and this is where the story starts connecting directly to the world we're living in right now. Stay with it, because the history ahead explains a lot about the headlines you've been reading. When European empires expanded across Africa, Asia, and the Americas beginning in the 15th and 16th centuries, they brought a lot of things with them. Disease, violence, new administrative systems, and a fundamentally different relationship to water. In many indigenous cultures around the world, water wasn't something you could own. It was a commons, a shared resource that belonged to the community, to the land, to the spiritual world. Water rights were often communal and managed through long-established local traditions. Colonial powers changed that almost everywhere they went. In India, the British systematically dismantled traditional water management systems, tanks, stepwells, local irrigation networks that had functioned for centuries, and replaced them with centralised canal systems that served British agricultural interests. The old systems fell into disrepair. Communities that had managed their own water for generations found themselves dependent on infrastructure they didn't control and couldn't maintain without British approval. In the American West, the story of water is essentially the story of colonization itself. When settlers arrived in the arid Southwest, they imposed a legal doctrine called prior appropriation, first come, first served. Whoever diverted the water first had the legal right to it. This systematically dispossessed native communities of water sources they had relied on for generations, while rewarding aggressive extraction by newcomers. The Rio Grande, the Colorado River. The Owens Valley, which was literally drained to feed the growth of Los Angeles, destroying an agricultural community in the process. A story told in Chinatown and documented in devastating historical detail. Water rights became property rights. Property rights became political power. And the people who already lived there, who already had relationships with the water, were written out of the equation. Now we arrive at the present. And this is where it stops feeling like ancient history and starts feeling uncomfortably familiar. Right now, roughly 2 billion people on Earth lack access to safe drinking water at home. About half the world's population faces severe water scarcity for at least part of the year. The Ogallala Aquifer, a vast underground water source that supplies agriculture across 8 American states, is being depleted far faster than it can naturally recharge. In some parts of it, the water table drops by a foot or more every year. Once it's gone on any human timescale. Meanwhile, a quiet but significant shift has been happening over the past few decades. The privatization of water. In the 1990s and 2000s, the World Bank pushed developing countries to privatize their water utilities as a condition of receiving loans. The idea was that private companies would manage water more efficiently than governments. In some cases, this happened. In many others, prices skyrocketed, the poorest communities lost access, and political tensions exploded. In Cochabamba, Bolivia in 2000, the government privatized the city's water supply under pressure from international lenders. The new private company immediately raised water rates by as much as 50%. People who earned a few dollars a day suddenly couldn't afford water. Protests erupted. The government declared martial law. A 17-year-old was shot and killed by security forces. Eventually, after months of conflict, the privatization was reversed. The event became known as the Cochabamba Water War, and it's studied in economics and political science programs around the world as a case study in what happens when you treat water purely as a commodity. And that tension between water as a human right and water as a privately owned resource is one of the defining conflicts of the 21st century. Nestlé's former CEO, Peter Brabeck-Letmathe, sparked enormous controversy in a 2005 documentary by suggesting that the idea of water as a public right was extreme and that water should have a market value. He later softened and clarified his statements, but the damage was done, and the underlying question he raised hasn't gone away. Who owns the water? Who decides who gets it? In the American West right now, water rights are being bought and sold like stock. Hedge funds and agricultural conglomerates are acquiring water rights in drought-prone regions. Some analysts are calling water the oil of the 21st century. Futures contracts for California water rights began trading on Wall Street in 2020, the first time in American history that water was traded as a financial commodity. History rhymes, as they say. The priest controlling the Sumerian canal gates has become the hedge fund manager with a portfolio of water rights. The mechanism is different, the dynamic is exactly the same. So where does this leave us? There are a few things the history makes clear. First, water crises don't announce themselves politely. They build slowly, then hit all at once. The Maya didn't know they were living through a civilization-ending drought until their systems were already breaking down. The American farmers of the 1920s didn't realize they were degrading their land until the topsoil started blowing to the horizon. By the time a water crisis becomes impossible to ignore, it's already very hard to solve. Second, access to water has always tracked access to power. The wealthy have always found ways to secure water for themselves first. That's not cynicism, it's just what the historical record shows over and over again across wildly different cultures and time periods. Understanding that pattern is the first step toward pushing back against it. Third, and maybe most importantly, the civilizations that survived water scarcity were the ones that treated it as a collective problem requiring collective solutions. The Nabateans of ancient Jordan built one of the most sophisticated rainwater harvesting systems in human history, capturing every drop that fell in the desert and channeling it into cisterns. They survived and thrived in one of the harshest environments on Earth for centuries. Their secret wasn't technology alone. It was a shared commitment to managing a scarce resource wisely. That's a model worth thinking about. Because the challenges ahead are real. Population growth, climate change, aging infrastructure, and political dysfunction are all converging on the same resource. The question isn't really whether water will become more contested. It already is. The question is whether we'll learn anything from 6,000 years of doing this badly. Water is the oldest story in human history, older than money, older than written language, older than war as we currently understand it. Every civilization that ever existed has grappled with the same basic problem. There's never exactly the right amount, in exactly the right place at exactly the right time. Too much water destroys, too little kills. Managing what's in between has occupied some of the greatest engineering minds in history and some of the most ruthless political operators. What's remarkable is how consistent the patterns are. The tools change, the names change. The underlying dynamics, control, scarcity, inequality, survival stay almost identical across millennia. Understanding that history doesn't make the problems easier, but it does make them less surprising. And less surprising problems are easier to face clearly. That's why this kind of history matters, not as trivia, not as entertainment, but as a map for understanding the world we're actually living in. If that's the kind of map you're looking for, the Origin Archive is where we draw them. Every piece we put out is about tracing the hidden roots of the world you see around you, the systems, the conflicts, the decisions made centuries ago that are still shaping your life right now. Subscribe if that's the kind of thing you want more of. There's a lot more to dig into.